He offered shelter to a lost little girl, and 3 days later he learned he was the one being tested. Blood streamed from Elia's roar-split brow, mixing with the acid rain that never stopped, falling on the ruins of Rusty Overflow Sector. His knives flashed through the throat of the last marauder, but victory came at a cost. 3 corpses lay in the puddle by his shelter's entrance, and the 4th attacker had fled, limping, leaving a crimson trail on the rusted metal. Ellis knew he would return with reinforcements. The question was when, and how many would come with him. It had started 3 days ago with that tapping, a weak arrhythmic knocking that cut through the monotonous noise of chemical rain. In this world, after the consortium's fall, every unfamiliar sound could mean death, and Elia's roar had learned to trust his instincts above all else. His hand moved instinctively to the crowbar, fixed to his belt, a weapon that had saved his life more times than he cared to count. Behind the tilted column of an old transport hub, partially buried under decades of corrosive precipitation, he found not an enemy, but something far more dangerous in its own way. Hope. The girl couldn't have been more than 7 years old, with twilight lavender skin that marked her as one of the Cathara, the blue-skinned species that had shared this world with human colonists before the Great Collapse. She was emaciated, her small frame shaking with cold and hunger, but her obsidian eyes held an intelligence that seemed far too old for her apparent age. She was tapping a small metal disc against the stone in a clear's throat pattern that seemed random but felt deliberate. Elia's roar had once been a colonial surveyor, one of the best in the consortium's employ. He had mapped hostile worlds where every step could trigger death from above or below, where alien predators stalked through crystalline forests and metal-eating bacteria dissolve survey equipment faster than it could be replaced. He had learned to read terrain, weather patterns, and the subtle signs that separated safe passage from certain doom. But reading people, especially children who had survived the hell this world had become, that was a different kind of surveying entirely. He approached slowly, keeping his hands visible and his movements unthreatening. "I'm Elia's," he said in the simplified trade Gothic that most survivors understood, regardless of their original species. "I won't hurt you." The girl looked up at him with those ancient eyes, and for a moment he felt as though he was being evaluated by something far older and more experienced than a lost child should be. "Kiera," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the constant patter of rain on metal. When he offered her his water canteen, she drank with the desperate thirst of someone who had been without clean water for days. In her small hands was a piece of fabric with embroidered lines that looked like star charts or navigation codes. The stitching was precise, professional, not the kind of work a child would do for play. Elias wrapped her in his jacket, feeling the sharp edges of her ribs through the thin fabric of her clothes as he carried her back to the geodetic station that had been his home for the past 3 years. He couldn't shake the feeling that this rescue was somehow more complicated than it appeared. The girl was too calm, too accepting of help from a stranger. Most children who had survived this long in the ruins had learned to fear adults, especially unfamiliar ones. The geodetic station had been built to withstand the harsh conditions of alien worlds, and Elias had spent years reinforcing its defenses against both environmental hazards and human threats. Solar Collectors provided power during the brief periods when the toxic clouds parted enough to let sunlight through. Water recyclers turned even acid rain into something approaching potability. After enough filtration, food stores were carefully rationed but adequate for one person living a disciplined life. For 3 days, Elias created a safe space for Kira within his carefully ordered world. He fed her portions of his own meals, modified his daily routines to account for her presence, and slowly nursed her back to something approaching health. She was a remarkably intelligent child, absorbing his lessons about the station systems and safety protocols with an ease that bordered on professional competence. She learned the locations of emergency supplies, the proper procedures for sealing blast shutters during toxic storms, and the hand signals he used to communicate when external conditions made speech impossible. Perhaps she learned too quickly. Elias had worked with survey teams that included members from dozens of different species, and he knew that Cathara children developed cognitive abilities faster than humans, but Kira's adaptation to her new environment felt less like learning and more like remembering. She seemed to instinctively understand concepts that should have been foreign to someone her age. On the third night, as Elias performed his evening security checks, a sound echoed through the station's corridors that made his blood freeze. Not the random banging of scavengers or the howling of storm winds, but a deliberate pattern of knocks against the main entrance. 3 short pause, 1 long pause, 3 short again. The same rhythm Kira had been tapping with her metal disc when he found her. Behind the reinforced door stood 2 women, both with the same lavender skin and obsidian eyes that marked them as Cathara. The taller one introduced herself as Kaelin, and there was an authority in her bearing that spoke of command experience. The shorter, more slender woman was LRA, and her eyes moved constantly, cataloging details of the station's defenses with the practiced gaze of a reconnaissance specialist. They were looking for the child, they said. Their search had brought them across hundreds of kilometers of hostile territory, following rumors and fragmentary reports from other survivors. When Elias led them inside, the reunion between Kira and the women felt genuine enough. But underneath the relief and affection, he sensed something else. Kaelin's embrace of the child was protective, but her eyes were performing a tactical assessment of the station's interior. This wasn't just a family reunion. This was an inspection. The next several days passed in an atmosphere of careful politeness that grew more strained with each passing hour. Kaelin and LRA integrated themselves into the station's routines with an efficiency that seemed too practiced for desperate refugees. They understood the purpose of equipment they shouldn't have recognized. Ask questions about supply routes and defensive positions that went far beyond casual curiosity, and moved with a coordination that suggested extensive training in small unit tactics. Elias, whose mind had been trained to notice discrepancies in terrain and equipment, began cataloging inconsistencies. Their story, their hands showed calluses, but not in the patterns typical of scavengers or wanderers. Their gear was worn but well-maintained, suggesting access to proper tools and supplies. Most tellingly, they seemed to know things about the local geography that contradicted their claimed route of travel. The first direct test came during what seemed like casual Conversation around the evening meal. Kalen mentioned with studied casualness that they had heard reports of the Rust Dogs gang patrolling the eastern approaches to this sector. It was delivered as a warning, a piece of intelligence shared between fellow survivors. Elias, who had been sharpening his knife with mechanical precision, replied without looking up. From his work, the Rust Dogs haven't operated east of here for 6 months. The tunnel collapse in Sector 7 cut off their supply routes, so they've been working the northern warehouse district. Instead, he tested the blad's edge against his thumb, drawing a thin line of blood. If you came from the east, you would have run into the Thornback hunting packs instead. The silence that followed was pregnant with implications. Kalen and LRA exchanged a look that lasted just a fraction of a second too long. It was a small thing, easily missed, but Elias had spent years reading the subtle communications between survey team members when verbal contact was impossible. They were testing him, and now they knew he was testing them back. LRA made the first attempt at damage control late one evening when Kalen was performing perimeter security checks with Kira. She approached Elias as he worked on repairing a water purification filter. "We haven't been completely honest with you," she began, settling herself on a crate beside his workbench. "We're not just refugees running from disaster. We're part of something called the Ark." She explained that the Ark was a growing network of survivor communities united by shared resources and mutual protection. They were scouts, she said, tasked with identifying potential safe havens and evaluating the people who might join their cause. The story about losing Kira during an attack was partially true, she claimed, but omitted the fact that the separation had been planned as part of their evaluation methodology. It was a reasonable explanation, and it accounted for many of the inconsistencies Elias had noticed, but something about the telling felt rehearsed, as though LRA had delivered this particular half-truth many times before. The story explained their capabilities and knowledge, but it raised new questions about their real purpose and the true nature of their organization. Before Elias could pursue these questions further, their conversation was interrupted by the piercing shriek of the station's motion detection system on the main security monitor. A shape moved through the ruins with mechanical precision, not human, not Cathera, not any of the native fauna that had adapted to this poison landscape. It was a consortium cleaner drone, one of the automated maintenance units that had been left behind when the corporate overlords abandoned this world to its fate. The drone was a spider-like construct of titanium and ceramic composites designed to perform infrastructure repairs in environments too dangerous for organic life, but its programming had degraded over the years of abandonment, and now it treated any unauthorized presence as contamination to be eliminated. Its sensor array swept back and forth across the approaches to the station, analyzing heat signatures and electromagnetic emissions. It's scanning for energy sources, Kalen said, and all pretense of being a simple refugee vanished from her voice. She spoke with the authority of someone who had dealt with consortium technology before, and her assessment was delivered with military precision. "If it detects us, it will call for support. We'll have a dozen hunter-killers here within the hour." There was no time for questions or explanations. Elias sealed the station's blast shutters and activated emergency power conservation protocols, reducing their electromagnetic signature to the minimum necessary for life support. LRA worked at the communication console, attempting to generate false readings that might confuse the drone sensors. Kaylin positioned herself at the main armory, checking their available weapons against the threat they faced. Even Kira participated, operating manual control systems with a competence that no child should possess. She sealed ventilation ducts that might leak telltale heat signatures and activated backup air recycling systems that operated on stored power rather than the main generators. Her actions were precise, purposeful, and completely at odds with her apparent age and experience. Drone search pattern brought it closer to the station. With each sweep through the armored windows, they could see its sensor clusters rotating and focusing as it analyzed every piece of debris, every anomalous reading in its environment. It moved with the patient thoroughness of a machine that had unlimited time and no capacity for boredom or frustration. When it finally clears throat, identified the station as a potential source of unauthorized activity, the drone's response was swift and decisive. Emergency broadcasts went out on consortium frequencies calling for backup and describing the nature of the threat. Within minutes, answering signals came back from across the sector. Other automated systems were responding to the alert, and some of them were far more dangerous than a single maintenance drone. We can't stay here, LRA said, monitoring the communication traffic. Hunter-killer units are already moving in from the north and west. We have maybe an hour before they arrive, but escape seemed impossible. The station's defenses were designed to keep threats out, not to provide escape routes for the inhabitants. The main entrance was overlooked by the drone's position, and the emergency exits led into open ground, where they would be easily spotted by aerial reconnaissance. Elias studied the tactical situation with the methodical approach he had learned during his surveying career. Every problem had a solution, but finding it required understanding all the variables involved. The drone sensors were sensitive but not omniscient. Its programming prioritized certain types of threats over others, and most importantly, it was operating alone until backup arrived. There's a weakness, he said, pointing to the drone's position on the monitor. It's positioned itself to observe the main approaches, but it's standing on the old maintenance platform for the sector's power grid. That platform is built over the primary thermal exchange chamber. Kaylin understood immediately. If we can destabilize the platform, the drone falls into the thermal pit. But how do we reach the platform without being detected? The answer lay in the station's original construction blueprints, which Elias had memorized during his initial survey of the facility. The thermal exchange chamber was connected to the station by a series of service tunnels that ran beneath the ruined infrastructure. The tunnels were narrow, filled with pipes and cables that would make movement difficult, but they provided a concealed approach to the drone's position. They moved through the tunnels in single file, with Elias leading and Kaylin bringing up the rear. The spaces were cramped and humid, filled with the residual heat from the geothermal systems that still function sporadically throughout this sector. Pipes dripped condensation that burned the skin on contact, and electrical cables sparked unpredictably as their Insulation failed after years of environmental exposure. Kira moved through the confined spaces within. Agility that seemed impossible for someone her size, but her breathing was too controlled, her movements too efficient. She was working hard to appear more capable than a normal child should be rather than struggling to keep up as she should have been. Maintenance platform proved to be complex structure of corroded metal and failing support systems. The drone had chosen its position well from a tactical standpoint, but it had not considered the structural integrity of its perch. Years of acid rain and thermal cycling had weakened the platform's foundations, and several support beams showed stress fractures that could be exploited. Elia's position charges at critical stress points while LRA and Kalen created a distraction. They activated an emergency beacon in a nearby building, drawing the drone's attention away from the platform long enough for Elias to complete sabotage. When the charges detonated, the platform collapsed in a cascade of twisted metal and sparking electronics, carrying the drone down into the thermal pit where its circuits were fried by electromagnetic pulses from the exposed power conduits. But their victory was short-lived. The drone's destruction had triggered additional automated responses, and the sound of approaching aircraft filled the air. Hunter-killer units were closing in from multiple directions, their advanced sensors sweeping the ruins for any sign of the intruders who had destroyed their mechanical colleague. "We need to move now," Kalen ordered, and again her voice carried the unmistakable authority of command. "The hunter-killers will carpet bomb this entire sector rather than risk losing more assets." They ran through the ruins as death approached from above. Hunter-killers were military-grade units designed for pacification operations against hostile populations. Their weapons could level city blocks, and their programming allowed for extensive collateral damage in pursuit of their objectives. The only safety lay in reaching areas where even they would not venture. The old chemical processing plant on the sector's eastern edge had been abandoned even before the consortium's withdrawal. Its storage tanks still leaked exotic compounds that were toxic to both organic life and electronic systems. The hunter-killer sensors would be degraded in that environment, and their weapon systems would malfunction if they stayed too long in the contaminated atmosphere. But reaching the plant meant crossing open ground under the direct observation of aerial surveillance. They would be exposed for nearly an hour, running across terrain that offered no concealment and little in the way of defensible positions. It was a desperate gamble, but their alternatives had been eliminated by the escalating automated response to their presence. They made the crossing in stages, using the wreckage of old vehicles and buildings as temporary shelter while the hunter-killers swept past. The machines were thorough but predictable, following search patterns that could be anticipated by anyone with tactical training. Alias found himself moving in coordination with Kalen and LRA, responding to hand signals and tactical communications as though he had trained with them for years. Kira kept pace with the adults despite her short legs, but her endurance was extraordinary for a child her age. She moved with economy and purpose, conserving energy for the long haul rather than sprinting in burning out. It was the kind of tactical thinking that came from extensive training, not natural ability. They reached the chemical plant just as the hunter-killers began their final sweep of the sector. The machines circled the contaminated area like predators, reluctant to enter dangerous territory, their sensors probing the toxic fog for signs of life, but the chemical interference was too severe for reliable detection, and eventually the units withdrew to await further orders from higher-level command systems. Inside the plant, they found temporary safety among the corroded machinery and leaking storage tanks. The air was thick with chemical vapors that burned their lungs and made their eyes water, but the environment was hostile enough to keep the hunter-killers at bay. They had bought themselves time, but at the cost of exposure to toxins that would eventually kill them if they stayed too long. It was in this poisonous sanctuary that the real confrontation finally occurred. The adrenaline of their escape had worn off, leaving behind the cold clarity of analysis and suspicion. Ilya's turned to face Kalen, his expression grim with certainty. Kira wasn't lost during an attack, he said, his voice cutting through the chemical haze. There was no attack. She was bait, wasn't she? Kalen met his gaze without flinching. There was no shame in her expression, no guilt or defensiveness, only the hard pragmatism of someone who had learned to make impossible choices in an impossible world. Yes, she confirmed it was a test. We place her in locations where she can be observed but not immediately threatened. If people ignore her or harm her, we move on. If someone helps her, we evaluate whether they might be suitable for recruitment. The explanation hit Ilya's like a physical blow. Everything he had believed about the situation, every noble impulse that had driven him to help a lost child, had been manipulated and exploited. His most fundamental values had been turned into weapons against him. We don't have the luxury of trusting strangers, LRA added, her voice softer but no less firm. Too many communities have been destroyed by people who seemed harmless at first. This method is harsh, but it works. It identifies both predators and protectors. Ayaz felt something cold and hard forming in his chest, a crystalline structure of anger and disappointment that threatened to freeze his capacity for trust entirely. The world had already taken so much from him: his career, his future, his faith in human civilization. Now it had corrupted even his desire to protect the innocent. And what about her? He asked, looking at Kira. What does this do to a child who's trained to be human bait? Kira stepped forward before either of the adults could answer. Her small face was serious, her obsidian eyes reflecting depths of experience that no child should possess. It was my turn, she said with quiet dignity. We all take turns. LRA did it when she was my age. Kalen did it. Everyone in the Ark has to prove they can contribute to our survival. The words hung in the toxic air like an indictment of the world they all inhabited. This wasn't just a story about manipulation and testing. It was about a community that had been forced to sacrifice its innocence in order to preserve its existence. They had turned their children into soldiers because the alternative was extinction. I'm not afraid, Kira continued. I know what I'm doing, and I know why it's important. We can't save everyone, but we can save the people who are worth saving. Ilyas looked at the three faces surrounding him in the chemical fog. A child who had been weaponized by necessity, two adults who had learned to make calculations that would have horrified their pre-war selves in himself, a man whose compassion had become a tactical vulnerability to be exploited. They were all victims of a world that had stripped away every luxury except survival itself. The silence stretched between them, filled with the distant sounds of hunter-killers searching for targets and the steady drip of chemical compounds eating through metal infrastructure. Finally, Elias spoke. If this was a test, he said slowly, what was the passing grade? Kalen's expression softened slightly, the first crack in her command demeanor since they had met. You helped her without asking what was in it for you. You shared your resources without negotiating terms, and when we showed up, you let us in despite your suspicions, but most importantly, LRA added, you adapted to threats and worked with us to survive. A lot of people freeze up when their worldview gets challenged. You kept functioning. Elias considered their words while toxic vapors swirled around them like spirits of the dead world they inhabited. Everything they said was true, but it was also incomplete. They had tested his compassion, his competence, and his adaptability, but they hadn't tested the one thing that mattered most in this new world, his commitment to something larger than his own survival. From his jacket pocket, he pulled out a waterproof case containing the most valuable thing he possessed, a complete topographical survey of the surrounding territories compiled during his years as a consortium surveyor. It showed not just the obvious geographical features, but the hidden resources, the safe passages, the defensive positions that could mean the difference between life and death for anyone trying to establish a permanent settlement. Your test is over, he said, unfolding the map on a corroded workbench. Here's my answer. The map revealed the true scope of what they were dealing with. The sector they were trapped in was just a small part of a vast wasteland that stretched for hundreds of kilometers in every direction, but it also showed something else. Locations where small communities might be able to establish themselves. Defended positions that could be held against both environmental hazards and human threats. Elias pointed to a location deep in the mountain range that bordered the eastern edge of the map. Geothermal station Echo 7, built by the consortium to tap deep thermal vents, then abandoned when the profit margins didn't justify the maintenance costs. It's completely self-sufficient, defended by natural barriers and far enough from population centers that most threats would bypass it entirely. He looked up at the three faces studying his map. You're looking for the Ark, the real one, not just another temporary shelter. This could be it. Kalen traced the route to Echo 7 with her finger, calculating distances and obstacles. It's a 150 kilometers through hostile territory, thornback hunting grounds, chemical waste zones, and at least 3 different raider territories. And that's just what we know about. LRA added, there could be consortium security systems still active in that area, automated defenses that shoot first and don't bother with questions. But Kira was studying the map with the intensity of someone much older than her apparent years. The mountain passes here, she said, pointing to a route that wound between peaks. These are seasonal migration routes for the blue wing flocks. If we time it right, the local predators will be following the migrations instead of hunting in their normal territories. Her analysis was sophisticated, taking into account factors that even experienced wilderness survivors might miss. It was another piece of evidence that this child was far more than she appeared to be. She's right, Elias confirmed the migration. Patterns create a window of opportunity. Every few months, but it's dangerous. Timing, if we're wrong about the schedule, will be caught in open country when the hunting season begins. They spent the next hour planning their route, pooling their knowledge of local conditions and threats. The chemical plant would provide temporary shelter while they prepared for the journey, but they couldn't stay long without suffering permanent damage from the toxic environment. They had perhaps 2 days to gather supplies and plan their approach before the contamination began, affecting their ability to function. The planning session revealed how much each of them brought to the group dynamic. Elias provided detailed knowledge of geography and environmental hazards. Kalen contributed tactical expertise and leadership experience. LRA offered reconnaissance skills and technical knowledge. Even Kira participated meaningfully, her observations showing a sophisticated understanding of biological systems and predator behavior, but it also revealed the tensions that lay beneath their forced cooperation. Trust was a luxury none of them could afford, but without it their chances of reaching Echo 7 alive were minimal. They were a group of strangers, united only by necessity, each carrying secrets and agendas that could destroy their alliance at any moment. The first test of their new partnership came sooner than expected on their second day in the chemical plant while they were preparing equipment for the journey. Ahead, LRA's monitoring equipment detected movement in the ruins surrounding their shelter, not the mechanical precision of hunter-killers, but the chaotic patterns of human raiders. Scavenger pack, she reported, studying the signal patterns, maybe 20 or 30 individuals moving in from the west. They're avoiding the most contaminated areas, but they're definitely heading this way. Elias studied the tactical situation through the plant's corroded windows. The scavengers were desperate people driven to extreme measures by hunger and desperation. They would risk the chemical contamination if they thought there was something valuable to be found, and any group that had survived long enough to operate in this sector would be heavily armed and completely ruthless. We can't fight them, Kalen said, performing her own assessment of their situation. Even if we win, the noise would bring the hunter-killers back, and if we lose, she didn't need to finish the sentence. Raiders didn't take prisoners, and they had particular uses for children that were too horrible to contemplate. The drainage system, Elias said, consulting his mental map of the plant's infrastructure. There's a network of tunnels that connects to the old water treatment facility about 3 km east. If we can reach it without being detected, we can use it to bypass the raiders entirely, but the drainage system was flooded with chemical runoff from decades of leaking storage tanks. The water was acidic enough to dissolve organic tissue in minutes, and the vapors would be fatal in enclosed spaces. They would need protective equipment that they didn't possess, or they would need to find another solution. Kira had been listening to their discussion while studying a schematic of the plant's layout. Now, she spoke up with another suggestion that revealed more sophisticated knowledge than a child should possess. The thermal venting system, she said, pointing to a series of pipes that ran beneath the plant's main structure. It's designed to carry steam from the geothermal taps to the processing units. The pipes are large enough to crawl through, and the thermal activity would mask our heat signatures from any surveillance. It was a brilliant solution, but it came with its own set of deadly risks. The pipes carried superheated steam at irregular intervals, and there was no way to predict when the system might activate. They would be crawling through a network of potential death traps, racing against time and the possibility that automated systems might cook them alive in their metal tunnel. How do you know about the thermal system? Elias asked, studying Kira with new intensity. The child met his gaze without flinching. I've been in places like this before. When you're small enough to fit in spaces adults can't reach, you learn about all the hidden passages. It was a reasonable explanation, but it raised new questions about where she had been and what she had been doing before their supposed chance encounter. Children didn't acquire knowledge of industrial infrastructure through casual exploration. They learned it through systematic training and repeated exposure to dangerous environments. But there was no time for detailed interrogation. The scavengers were closing in, and their window of opportunity was shrinking rapidly. They gathered their essential equipment and prepared to enter the thermal system, knowing that they were trading one set of deadly risks for another. The entrance to the thermal tunnels was through a maintenance hatch in the plant's basement level. The space beyond was cramped and dark, filled with the sound of moving steam and the occasional clang of expanding metal. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows on the tunnel walls, and the air shimmered with heat distortion from the pipes around them. They moved in single file, with Kira leading because her small size allowed her to navigate the tightest spaces. Elias followed, then LRA, with Kalen bringing up the rear and watching for pursuit. The tunnels were a maze of interconnected passages, some barely wide enough for an adult to squeeze through, others opening into chambers filled with massive pipe junctions and pressure relief valves. The heat was oppressive, making every breath feel like inhaling fire. Sweat poured down their faces and soaked through their clothing, but they didn't dare stop to rest. Behind them they could hear the sounds of the scavengers searching the plan above, their voices echoing through the ventilation systems as they called out to each other. Halfway through the tunnel system, disaster nearly struck. A pressure relief valve activated without warning, filling a junction chamber with superheated steam. Kira barely managed to warn the others in time, pressing herself against the tunnel wall as a geyser of scalding vapor erupted from the pipes around her. But the near miss revealed something disturbing about their young guide. Instead of being terrified by the close call, Kira had reacted with the calm professionalism of someone who had faced similar dangers many times before. Her warning had been precise and timely, delivered in technical terminology that no civilian child should have known. They emerged from the thermal tunnels 3 hours later, exhausted and dehydrated, but alive. The water treatment facility that housed the tunnel exit was abandoned but structurally sound, providing temporary shelter while they recovered from their ordeal. Through the facility's windows, they could see smoke rising from the chemical plant as the scavengers set fires to flush out anything they might have missed. We can't go back, Lear observed, watching the destruction of their former shelter. Even if the raiders move on, the fires will compromise what's left of the containment systems. That whole area will be uninhabitable for weeks. It was a harsh reminder of how quickly their situation could change in this unforgiving world. They had lost their safe house, used up most of their emergency supplies, and gained nothing except the knowledge that they could work together under pressure. The journey to Echo 7 had become more urgent and more dangerous. They spent the rest of the day planning their next move. The water treatment facility was too exposed to serve as a long-term shelter, but it offered resources they could use for the journey ahead. The purification systems could provide clean water if they could get them operational, and the Fassil's workshop contained tools that might prove useful for equipment repairs as they worked to make the facility habitable. Alas found himself observing his companions with new attention. The crisis in the chemical plant had stripped away some of their careful facades, revealing capabilities and knowledge that didn't fit their cover stories. Kalen's tactical leadership was too polished for someone who claimed to be a community organizer. LRA's technical skills extended far beyond what a scout would need, and Kira's performance throughout their escape had been that of a trained operative, not a frightened child. The confrontation came that evening as they shared a meal of purified water and emergency rations. Elias looked across their makeshift table at the three faces he was beginning to know, and decided that honesty was the only foundation on which they could build genuine trust. "We're not telling each other the truth," he said without preamble. "Any of us. We're all carrying secrets that could get the others killed, and we're running out of time to come clean." The silence that followed was filled with calculations and assessments. Each of them was weighing risks, deciding how much truth they could afford to reveal without compromising their own safety or mission. Kalen spoke first. "You're right, we haven't been completely honest about the Ark or our role in it." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "The Ark isn't just a community of survivors. It's a military organization built from the remnants of consortium security forces and colonial defense units. We're trying to establish a power base that can eventually reclaim and rebuild this world." It was a significant revelation, explaining much about their capabilities and methods, but it also raised disturbing questions about their ultimate goals and the methods they were willing to use to achieve them. "My turn," LRA said. "I'm not just a scout, I'm an intelligence officer formerly attached to the Consortium's Strategic Assessment Division. My job is to evaluate potential threats and assets in territories we're considering for incorporation into our sphere of influence." Elias absorbed this information, understanding now why her questions had felt like interrogations, and her observations had been so precisely targeted. She was conducting a professional intelligence assessment, not simply trying to get to know him. "And Kira?" he asked, looking at the child, who had remained silent throughout these revelations. "Kira is exactly what she appears to be," Kalen said, "a child who has been trained to survive in an environment that kills most adults. She's been with us since she was 4 years old when we found her in the ruins of her family settlement, but she's also one of our most effective intelligence assets." The child looked up at Elias with those ancient eyes. "I'm good at being invisible," she said. "Simply, people tell me things they wouldn't tell adults. And I remember everything." It was a chilling glimpse into the kind of world they were building where children were turned into spy weapons and innocence was just another resource to be exploited for tactical advantage, but it was also a testament to the kind of pragmatic ruthlessness that might be necessary to rebuild civilization from its ashes. "Your turn," Kalen said, looking at Elias expectantly. He had been expecting this moment, and he had spent hours deciding how much of his own truth he was willing to share. The story of his past was dangerous knowledge, but these people had trusted him with secrets that could destroy them. Reciprocity was both a moral obligation and a tactical necessity. "I wasn't just a surveyor," he began. "I was part of a classified consortium program called Deep Sea Graphy. We mapped not just geography, but strategic resources, defensive positions, and potential colony sites that weren't included in the public records. I know the locations of hidden supply caches, classified research facilities, and military installations that were never officially acknowledged. The implications hit them immediately. If Elias' knowledge was accurate and complete, he possessed intelligence that could determine the success or failure of their entire rebuilding effort. He knew where the most valuable resources were hidden, which locations offered the best strategic advantages, and which areas contained threats that were too dangerous to approach. Echo 7 LRA said, understanding dawning in her voice. "You didn't recommend it because it's a safe haven. You recommended it because you know what's really there." Ella's nodded grimly. "Echo 7 isn't just geothermal power station. It's a deep sea graphy archive facility built to house survey data and strategic intelligence for the entire sector. If it's still intact, it contains enough information to give your arc a decisive advantage over every other faction competing for control of this territory." The revelation changed everything about their mission. They weren't just fleeing to a safe haven, they were racing to secure a strategic asset that could determine the future of human civilization on this world. But it also meant that other factions would be interested in Echo 7 if they knew what it contained, and the journey there would be even more dangerous than they had originally anticipated. "Does anyone else know about the archive?" Kalen asked. "The Deep Sea Graphy program was highly classified, but the consortium's collapse was chaotic. Records were scattered, personnel were reassigned or killed, and security protocols broke down. It's possible that other survivor groups have pieced together fragments of information about sites like Echo 7. They spent the next several hours revising their plans in light of these new revelations. The journey to Echo 7 was no longer just a desperate flight to safety, but a military operation with strategic implications that extended far beyond their immediate survival. They would need to move fast, avoid detection, and be prepared to fight for control of the facility once they arrived. But they also had to consider the possibility that they were already too late. If other factions had discovered the true nature of Echo 7, they might find the facility occupied by hostile forces with superior numbers and equipment. The archive that could secure their future might already be in enemy hands. The next morning brought news that confirmed their worst fears. LRA's monitoring equipment detected military-grade communication signals emanating from the direction of Echo 7. Encrypted transmissions were bouncing between the facility and mobile units positioned throughout the surrounding territory. Someone else had reached the archive first, and they had brought enough personnel to establish a significant defensive perimeter. Can you break the encryption? Elias asked, watching LRA work with equipment that was far more sophisticated than anything a simple scout should possess. Partially, she replied, her fingers flying over the device's controls. It's a modified consortium military protocol. But I'm only getting fragments. References to asset recovery, perimeter security, and something called Project Renaissance. Kalen's expression darkened at the mention of the last term. Project Renaissance was a consortium contingency plan for rebuilding civilization after a complete colonial collapse. The theory was that if the normal governance structures failed, military forces would establish temporary authority and guide the reconstruction process. Temporary, Elias repeated with bitter humor. Military governments always start out temporary. The situation was becoming clearer and more dangerous. A consortium remnant faction had reached Echo 7 and was implementing a plan to use the archived intelligence for their own rebuilding efforts. They would not welcome competitors, and they would certainly not negotiate with a small group of refugees who claimed ownership rights to the facility. But retreat was not an option. Without the resources and intelligence stored in Echo 7, the Ark would remain a scattered collection of survivor communities with no realistic chance of developing into a true power base. They had to attempt to reach the facility, even if it meant fighting for access against a superior force. The final stage of their journey took them through terrain that challenged every survival skill they possessed. The mountain approaches to Echo 7 were a maze of unstable rockfall zones, chemical seepage areas, and territories claimed by the largest and most dangerous native predators. The thornbacks that had pursued them earlier were minor threats compared to the apex hunters that ruled these remote peaks. They traveled at night when possible, using thermal barriers to mask their heat signatures, and moving through valleys where the rocky terrain would provide cover from aerial surveillance. During the day, they sheltered in caves and abandoned mining installations, rationing their supplies and monitoring the communications traffic from Echo 7 facility was clearly under the control of a well-organized military unit. Patrol schedules were precise, communication protocols were professional, and defensive positions were established with textbook efficiency. But there were also signs of strain in their operations. References to equipment failures, supply shortages, and personnel casualties suggested that holding Echo 7 was proving more challenging than the occupying force had anticipated. They're fighting something, LRA observed, after analyzing several days of intercepted communications. References to containment breaches and biological countermeasures suggest they're dealing with threats from inside the facility. Elias considered this information while studying his maps of Echo 7's internal layout. The archive was built to house strategic intelligence, but it was also used for classified research projects. If the containment systems failed during the collapse, he didn't need to finish the thought. Research facilities of that era had worked with everything from engineered biological weapons to experimental artificial intelligence systems. If something had been released inside Echo 7, it might pose a threat to anyone who entered the facility. regardless of their military capabilities, but it also represented an opportunity if the occupying force was dealing with internal threats there. External defenses might be weakened. Small mobile team might be able to infiltrate the facility while the defenders were focused on containing whatever was loose inside. They reached the final approach to Echo 7 just before dawn on their 7th day of travel. The facility was an impressive sight, even its current state. A complex of reinforced structures built into the mountainside, connected by armored walkways and defended by automated systems that had survived decades of environmental assault, but it was also clearly under siege. Military vehicles were positioned around the perimeter, their weapons trained not outward toward potential attackers but inward toward the facility itself, whatever was inside. Echo 7 was trying to get out in the consortium. Remnant forces were fighting to keep it contained. Change of plan, Kalen said, observing the situation through binoculars. We're not just infiltrating a defended facility, we're walking into an active combat zone with unknown hostile forces. The sound of weapons fire echoed across the valley as they watched, and one of the facility's external barriers exploded in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. Through the breach emerged something that moved with fluid grace despite its massive size. Bioengineered creature with blue-tinted armor plating and natural weapons that could shred metal. Consortium bioweapons, Elias said grimly. They were experimenting with accelerated evolution and genetic modification. Looks like some of their test subjects survived the collapse. The creatures were beautiful and terrible, combining the efficient design of natural predators with enhancements that made them nearly unstoppable killing machines. They moved in coordinated groups, suggesting retained intelligence despite their physical modifications, and they were clearly winning their battle against the human defenders. We can use this, LRA said, her tactical mind already adapting to the new situation. While they're fighting each other, we can infiltrate the archive sections and retrieve what we need. The bioweapons don't seem interested in preserving the facility's contents. It was a desperate plan with almost no chance of success, but it was their only option. They had come too far and risked too much to retreat now. Intelligence stored in Echo 7 represented their best chance of building a future worth living, and they would have to fight both human enemies and artificial monsters to claim it. They began their final approach as the battle raged. Around them, 4 small figures moving through a war zone where the stakes were nothing less than the future of human civilization on this poisoned world. Tests that had begun with a lost child and a stranger's kindness had evolved into something far larger and more dangerous than any of them had imagined. But they had survived everything this world had thrown at them so far, and they had learned to trust each other in the process. Whatever waited for them inside Echo 7, they would face it together. The girl who had been bait, the soldier who had been tested, the spy who had revealed her secrets, and the surveyor who held the keys to their future. Their real test was just beginning. The infiltration of Echo 7 required every skill they had developed during their desperate journey across the wasteland. The facility's main entrance was heavily defended by Consortium remnant forces, but the bioweapons assault had created multiple breaches in the perimeter that could be exploited by a small agile team, Elias led them through a collapsed section of the outer wall, using his knowledge of the facility's construction to avoid the most heavily monitored approaches. Inside the complex, the signs of battle were everywhere. Corridors were scarred by energy weapons and claw marks. Emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red shadows, and the air was thick with the smell of ozone and spilled blood. Bodies lay scattered throughout the passages, both human defenders and bioengineered creatures that had been stopped by concentrated firepower. The archive is in the central core, Elias whispered, consulting his mental map of the facility. We need to reach the main data vault, but it's 3 levels down and probably defended by whatever security forces are still alive. They moved through the facility like ghosts, avoiding the main corridors, where surviving defenders had established kill zones and fire positions. The bioweapons had adapted to the environment with frightening speed, using their enhanced intelligence to coordinate attacks and exploit weaknesses in the human defensive lines. In the facility's medical wing, they encountered their first live enemy, a bioengineered hunter that had been separated from its pack. The creature was magnificent and terrifying, standing nearly 3 m tall with blue-cowled armor that seemed to absorb and redirect energy weapon strikes. Its natural weapons were razor-sharp claws and teeth that could shear through metal, and its enhanced nervous system gave it reaction times faster than any natural predator. But it was also wounded, bleeding, blue-eyed core from several projectile impacts, and its movements were slower than they should have been. Consortium forces had learned how to hurt these things even if they couldn't stop them reliably. Kaelin took point, with her twin daggers, moving with the fluid grace of someone who had trained for close quarters combat against superhuman opponents. She feinted left, drawing the creature's attention, then rolled right as its claws raw the air. Where she had been standing, LRA provided covering fire with a crossbow she had salvaged from the facility's armory, her bolts targeting the creature's joints where the armor plating was thinner. Elias flanked wide, looking for an opening to strike at vital points, while Kira did what she did best, stayed invisible and gathered intelligence from her concealed position. She called out warnings about the creature's attack patterns and identified weak spots in its defenses. The battle was brief but vicious. When it ended, the bioweapon lay dead in a pool of its own luminescent blood, and they had learned valuable lessons about fighting these enhanced predators. They were dangerous but not invincible, and their intelligence made them predictable in some ways, even as it made them more effective killers. The blood, Kira observed, studying the fallen creature. It's not just blue, there are patterns in it, like some kind of biological circuitry. She was right. The bioweapon circulatory system seemed to carry more than just nutrients and oxygen. There were traces of what looked like organic computational matrices, suggesting that these creatures had been engineered with biological computer systems integrated into their physiology. Living weapons platforms, LRA said with professional interest. They're not just enhanced animals, they're organic machines designed for specific combat roles. It was a chilling insight into the consortium's final research projects. They had been working on creatures that combined the adaptability of natural evolution with the precision of engineered systems. The bioweapons weren't just predators, they were intelligent combat units that could think, plan, and coordinate their attacks with tactical sophistication. The deeper they penetrated into Echo 7, the more evidence they found of the desperate battle being fought between human defenders and engineered monsters. Barricades had been hastily erected across key corridors. Ammunition supplies were running low, and the surviving consortium forces were clearly being pushed back toward the facility's core. But they also found signs that the bioweapons were not operating without direction. Hidden among the carnage were communication devices that seemed to be coordinating the creature's attacks. Someone or something was controlling these monsters, turning them from random threats into organized military units. There, Elias pointed to a communication node embedded in what had once been a beautiful piece of bioengineered flesh. That's not natural evolution. Someone's installed command and control systems in these things. The implications were staggering. If the bioweapons were being controlled remotely, then their assault on Echo 7 wasn't just an outbreak of contained experiments, it was a military operation designed to capture or destroy the facility's strategic assets. Another faction, Kalen said grimly. Someone else knows about the archive, and they're using the bioweapons to eliminate the consortium defenders. Before moving in to claim the intelligence, they reached the entrance to the central archive just as the final battle began. Above them, through the facility's communication systems, they could hear the last consortium defenders calling for evacuation support that would never come. The bioweapons had overrun the upper levels, and it was only a matter of time before they reached the archive itself. The archive entrance was sealed by multiple layers of security, but Elias clearance codes were still valid in the emergency systems. As the massive doors cycled open, they found themselves looking into a cathedral-like chamber filled with data storage devices that contained the accumulated knowledge of an entire colonial sector. But they were not alone. At the center of the archive, working frantically at a master terminal, was a figure in consortium military uniform. Captain Miranda Voss, according to her name tag, was attempting to download critical files before the facility's destruction became inevitable. She looked up as they entered, her hand moving instinctively toward her sidearm, but when she saw that they were human rather than bioengineered killers, she hesitated just long enough for Kalen to get within striking distance. Don't, Kalen warned, her own weapon drawn and ready. We're not here to fight you, but we will if we have to. Captain Voss assessed the situation with professional calm. She was outnumbered, trapped, and running out of time as the sounds of battle grew closer. Her mission to secure the archive was failing, but these newcomers might represent an opportunity to salvage something from the disaster. You're after the deep seagraphy files, she said, reading their tactical positioning and equipment. Someone told you what's really stored here. We know about Project Renaissance, LRA replied. And we know about the bioweapons. Who's controlling them? Voss's laugh was bitter and exhausted. We thought we were the only consortium survivors with access to the old research facilities. Turns out there's a whole network of remnant groups, and they're not interested in sharing resources or cooperating for mutual benefit. She explained that the bioweapon assault was being coordinated by another consortium, faction that called itself the Hegemony. They had taken control of several research facilities and were using the engineered creatures as expendable shock troops to eliminate competing survivor groups. They want the archive intact, but they want us dead, Voss continued. And when they're done here, they'll move on to eliminate every other faction that might challenge their version of the new world order. The sound of claws on metal echoed through the corridors outside the archive. The bioweapons had reached this level and they would be through the sealed doors within minutes. Whatever decision they made about the archive's contents would have to be made quickly. How much data can we extract? Elias asked, studying the archive systems. Maybe 20%, Voss replied. The critical, strategic files, some of the research data, enough to give your faction a significant advantage, but not everything. Too much data, not enough time. Kira had been studying the archive's layout while the adults talked. Now she spoke up with another suggestion that revealed her sophisticated understanding of information systems. We don't need to extract the data, she said. We need to deny it to the Hegemony. If we can't have it, they can't either. She was proposing to destroy the archive rather than let it fall into enemy hands. It was a devastating solution that would eliminate the intelligence they had risked everything to obtain, but it would also prevent their enemies from gaining a decisive strategic advantage. The quantum cores, Ellis said, understanding her logic. If we destabilize the primary storage matrix, the cascade failure will wipe everything. No data recovery, no strategic advantage for anyone, Captain. Voss looked horrified at the suggestion. You're talking about destroying irreplaceable knowledge, scientific advances, exploration data, cultural record, centuries of human achievement that will be used to enslave the survivors, Kalen replied harshly. I've seen what the Hegemony does to communities that resist their authority. This data is too dangerous to leave intact. The moral calculus was brutal and immediate. They could attempt to extract what intelligence they could carry and hope it would be enough to give the Ark a fighting chance, or they could ensure that no faction gained a decisive advantage by destroying everything their enemies sought to claim. The decision was made for them when the archive doors exploded inward under the assault of bioengineered claws and teeth. 3 of the creatures poured through the breach, their enhanced senses immediately identifying the humans as targets for elimination. But these bioweapons were different from the lone hunter they had encountered earlier. These moved with coordinated precision, their attacks perfectly timed to support each other and eliminate escape routes. They had been programmed for exactly this kind of close-quarters combat in confined spaces. The battle in the archive was unlike anything they had experienced before. The bioweapons used the chamber's vertical space to their advantage, leaping between data storage towers and attacking from unexpected angles. Their natural weapons could slice through metal and stone, and their enhanced intelligence allowed them to adapt their tactics in real time. Captain Voss proved to be a capable ally, her military training evident in her precise shooting and tactical movement. She coordinated her fire with LRA's crossbow shots, targeting the creature's sensory organs to disrupt their coordination systems. Elias and Kalen worked together to drive the bioweapons into kill zones where concentrated fire could overcome their armor plating, but ammunition was limited, and the creatures seemed to have unlimited endurance. The turning point came when Kira noticed something the adults had missed: the bioweapons. Coordination was being maintained through organic transmitters embedded their skulls, but those transmitters were vulnerable to electromagnetic interference from the archive's quantum storage systems. The power grid, she shouted over the sound of battle. If we overload the storage matrix, it'll jam their communication network. It was a desperate gamble that would accomplish their mission of denying the archive to the hegemony, but it would also trap them in a collapsing facility with 3 enraged bioweapons. But their alternatives had been eliminated by the creature's relentless assault. Elias reached the archive's primary control station and began the overload sequence. Warning lights flashed throughout the chamber as quantum storage systems began destabilizing the bioweapons. Coordinated attacks became confused and erratic as their communication links failed, but the creatures were still deadly individual opponents, and the archive's destruction would take several minutes to complete. They had to survive long enough for the cascade failure to eliminate the stored data and create enough electromagnetic interference to disable the bioweapons enhancement systems. The final battle was a desperate running fight through chamber filled with priceless knowledge that was being systematically destroyed by its own security systems. Data storage towers collapsed under the creature's assault. Quantum cores erupted in cascades of energy that scorched the air around them, and the accumulated wisdom of human civilization burned in fires that were hot enough to melt metal. When the archive's destruction reached critical mass, the electromagnetic pulse was powerful enough to disrupt every electron system in the facility. The bioweapons collapsed as their enhancement systems failed, their artificially augmented nervous systems unable to function without technological support. In the sudden silence that followed, 5 humans stood among the wreckage of humanity's greatest repository of knowledge. They had survived, but they had also destroyed the very thing they had come to claim. Was it worth it? Captain Boss asked, looking at the devastation around them. Ask me in 50 years, Kalen replied, when we see what kind of world we managed to build without this information, and what kind of world the hegemony builds without it. They made their escape from Echo 7 as the facility's remaining automated systems began emergency shutdown procedures. The hegemony forces outside had been decimated by their own bioweapons when the communication links failed, and the surviving consortium defenders were too few and too scattered to mount effective resistance. But their journey was far from over. The destruction of the archive had sent signals throughout the sector, alerting every faction to the location of a major battle. Soon the area would be crawling with scavengers, military units, and other groups seeking to claim whatever resources remained in the ruins. Captain Voss joined their group as they began the long journey back to Ark territory. She brought military expertise and knowledge of consortium remnant factions that would prove invaluable in the struggles ahead, but she also brought news of the larger conflict that was developing across the sector. The hegemony isn't the only threat, she explained as they made camp in a defensible position several kilometers from Echo 7. There are at least 6 major factions competing for control of this territory, and most of them have access to pre-collapsed military hardware. The world they were trying to rebuild was already at war with itself, and the destruction of the Echo 7 archive had eliminated one potential path to victory, while ensuring that no single faction could claim decisive superiority. It was a Pyrrhic victory that had cost them everything they had hoped to gain, but it had also proven something important about their group dynamic. They had faced impossible choices and deadly enemies together, and they had emerged with their integrity intact. The test that had begun with a lost child in a stranger's kindness had evolved into something much larger, a test of what kind of people they wanted to be in the world they were trying to create. As they planned their route back to Ark territory, Alias reflected on how much had changed since he had found Kira tapping her metal disc in the ruins. He had been a solitary survivor, focused only on his own continued existence. Now, he was part of something larger, committed to building a future that would be worth the sacrifices they had made to secure it. The test was over, but the real work was just beginning. They had proven they could survive and fight and make hard choices when necessary. Now they had to prove they could build something better than what they had destroyed. The rain had stopped falling for the first time in months, and through breaks in the toxic clouds, they could see stars that promised cleaner skies ahead. They were no longer the same people who had met in a chemical fog-shrouded ruin. They were the founding members of something new, united not by blood or convenience, but by shared trials and common purpose. The world was still broken, still dangerous, still filled with factions that would kill for the chance to impose their vision of the future on everyone else. But it was also filled with possibilities that hadn't existed before. The archive's destruction leveled the playing field. They shouldered their packs and began walking toward an uncertain dawn. 4 survivors who had become something more than the sum of their individual capabilities. The test that had brought them together was complete, but their real test as builders of the future was just beginning.